Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome to Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson. I'm your host, and for the next half hour, I'm going to be ranting away at you at things that I actually do think are very important and you should pay attention to. If you have any reactions to the show, you can email them to me directly. My personal email, Whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or if you prefer, you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be around here somewhere during the show. You can go there, you can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. If you do send me email, please, like always, be sure to include something in the subject line to make it clear this is not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer. So, with that, let's get on with it. A little bit unusual today. We're just going to cover two topics, one in the first part of the show and the other in the second. Because a couple of weeks ago, I had some anniversaries to celebrate, to note. The 50th birthdays of Medicare, Medicaid, and the Voting Rights Act, and the 70th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, this week I have another birthday to mark. On August 14th, Social Security turned 80. You would expect, get some hooray, good job, well done, what a great program, but in what should have come as a surprise actually to no one, the day was greeted instead with a spate of widely distributed articles claiming that the system either is or soon will be on its deathbed. Now, make no mistake here. Make no mistake. The claim that you have no doubt seen that Social Security is running out of money or it needs an overhaul, all of which proposals always involve benefit cuts, or that it will go belly up in 20 years or whatever, and the one that's addressed to younger workers, that Social Security will not be there for you when it's time for you to retire. These are all lies. Flat out lies. I won't even call them misunderstandings or inaccuracies. They are lies. Lies that are intended to undermine support for a program that the right wing has hated from the get-go. Hated because it was a government program designed to help people, and have learned to hate it even more over the years because it works so well. And from the get-go, I do mean from the get-go, when Social Security is actually being debated in Congress in the 1930s, opponents claimed it would bring an end to American freedom. Seriously. For example, one member of Congress warned that the people would feel the lash of the dictator, quote-unquote. Another said Social Security opens the door to a power so vast, so great, that it threatens to bring down the pillars of the temple on the heads of our descendants. And a third insisted it would end the progress of this great nation. Now, the right wing has not stopped trying to undermine Social Security, but they've learned to change tactics. Instead of calling it a threat to freedom, they've just fearmonger about how unaffordable and unsustainable the system is. And again, it's all lies. There was one widely circulated article, in fact, I'm going to talk about this. It was from a guy named Stephen Olemacher of the Associated Press. And so this article appeared in papers all over the country, because it was an Associated Press article. And it will be headlined with some variation of Social Security at 80, time for an overhaul. It would have been hard to imagine that this article would have been more tilted against Social Security had it been written by some far right-wing think tank. But for just that particular reason, plus its widespread distribution, it becomes a good template for rebutting the lies. The article starts with what is really boilerplate fear-mongering, quoting, Social Security's disability fund is projected to run dry next year. The retirement fund has enough money to pay full benefits until 2035, but once the fund is depleted, the shortfalls are projected to be enormous. Okay, deal with the disability part first, 'cause it's a little bit subtle. Social Security actually has two trust funds. The Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund, which is what we usually think of when we think of Social Security, and the Social Security Disability Insurance Trust Fund. The money that comes in from payroll taxes is distributed between those two funds, with the vast majority obviously going to the Old Age Survivors Trust Fund because it's much, much bigger. Well, over the years of Social Security, there have been 11 times when the trustees have changed, altered the percentages of the monies coming in to, as to how it's divided between those two funds, depending upon which one of the two needed a little extra boost at that moment. This has always been uncontroversial. It has been routine. It's always been approved by Congress, no problems. And the last time one of these reallocations of tax income was done was in 1994. And at that time, it was predicted by the trustees that the Disability Insurance Fund would need to be replenished in, guess when, 2016. The need for replenishment of the fund in 2016 is exactly what has been predicted for the past 20 years. The only reason this presents the possibility of a crisis is that in the first day of the new Congress in January, the GOPR leaders of the House of Representatives passed a rule for House operations that said it would be out of order for Congress to pass any measure that reduced the actuarial balance of the Social Security retirement account. No, but the thing is, obviously, there's no way to reallocate any proportion of money from the retirement account into the disability fund without affecting the actuarial balance of the retirement fund. The effect would be small, but it would not be zero. Put bluntly, the crisis in disability insurance was created deliberately by the right wing. But the article mentions this rule only in passing. It never explains the effect it would have, but instead describes it as related to, quote, improving the overall financial health of the system, and allows the disability program to be called plagued by waste and abuse without challenge, rebuttal, or evidence. And saying that the fund will be depleted in 2035, I mean, that's total and complete garbage. It really is. Here's the thing. Starting back in 1977, payroll taxes are increased to build up a surplus in the trust funds to deal with the baby boomer demographic bulge in retirees that everyone knew would be coming around 2010. The trustees' latest report says that the Social Security trust funds now have $2.8 trillion in assets, and that amount is expected to grow until 2019. Now, at that point, at 2019, the prediction is that payments out of the system will start to exceed income from taxes coming into the system, and the system will have to dip into that surplus to pay full benefits. That is what will be depleted, it's now predicted, in 2035. The surplus. The surplus that was deliberately created to deal with the increasing demands on the system. The surplus that was deliberately created so it would be there to dip into when you needed it. And in 2035, at that point, when the surplus is depleted, the system would be back onto the pay-as-you-go basis on which Social Security has operated virtually its entire history. It would be, if you want to think of it this way, back to business as usual. But that's not all. The article has more scare tactics. I'm quoting. In 1960, there were more than 5 workers for every person receiving Social Security. Today, there are fewer than 3. In 20 years, there will be about 2 workers for every person getting benefits. Oh my gosh, that's only 2 workers per... How will we ever afford that? Except that workers versus retirees is a false and meaningless comparison. Workers don't just support retirees, they support all non-workers. Their families, their children, their spouse or partner if that person doesn't work. And even as the number of retirees is growing, family size is shrinking. Over those next few decades, even as the ratio of workers to retirees is expected to go down, fewer workers per retiree, the ratio of workers to non-workers is expected to go up, more workers per non-worker. So the burden on workers may, just be about just the same. It's just that in effect, some portion of that burden will have been shifted from supporting their children to supporting their parents. But wait. No, got to get back to this. Back in 2035. In 2035, when we're back to pay-as-you-go, Social Security, we're told, would collect only enough taxes to pay about 79% of scheduled benefits. That's a 21% benefit cut. We have to cut benefits now to avoid that big hit later. Well, okay, the 79% figure is true if you also assume that absolutely nothing is done in these intervening 20 years. The system, in fact, has been tweaked and adjusted numerous times across its 80-year history, and it will probably have to be tweaked again. But presenting it as a choice between cut benefits now and cut benefits more later is a false one. There are lots of other options. And here's an interesting thing I bet no one's told you. Note the reference there to scheduled benefits, 79% of scheduled benefits. The trustees of the trust funds make calculations of future costs and benefits based on various scenarios of how the economy will play out, including projections of inflation. And the increases in benefits are projected based on inflation. However, initial benefits for a new retiree are on a wage base. They're on a wage base. It's a form that calculates, I think, your greatest 5 years over the last 10 years of your working life. I don't remember the exact formula, but it's based on wages. And the thing is, measured over decades, that is basically the lifespan, the working life of a typical worker, wages tend to rise a bit faster than inflation. Which means projected, that is scheduled initial benefits, also rise faster than inflation. The bottom line here is that what this means, and the projections of inflation, 79% of scheduled benefits in 2035 will provide about the same standard of living as current benefits do today. So no, it's not a good standard of living. But to say that we, in 20 years, if we do absolutely nothing at all in the interim, that we'll be able to provide the same standard of living to a new retiree as we do now, hardly strikes me as a system in crisis or going belly up or bankrupt or insolvent or any of the other words that are thrown around without regard to their meaning. And by the way, one other little tidbit just to throw in here. Okay, 3 years ago, in 2012, instead of predicting being able to pay 79% of benefits in 2035, the prediction was being able to pay only 75% of scheduled benefits in 2033. All right, finally, of course, we have the scare with big numbers tactic. Quoting the article, over the next 75 years, Social Security is projected to pay out $159 trillion more in benefits than it will collect in taxes. That is not a typo. Wow, that's scary. Except, the U.S. gross domestic product is now about $17.5 trillion a year. Even if you assume no expansion of the economy at all, over that same 75 years, the economy will generate over $1.3 quadrillion in goods and services. You want to deal in big numbers? We'll deal in big numbers. Between 1933 and 2015, the mean annual real growth in the U.S. gross domestic product. That means the average yearly growth, not allowing for inflation. This is real growth. The mean annual real growth in U.S. GDP has been 4.4%. That is, our real GDP has grown an average of 4.4% a year over the last 80 years. If that average was maintained, in that 75th year in the future, when the accumulated payments beyond income of Social Security would be $159 trillion, the U.S. GDP in that single year would be $440 trillion. The magic of compound interest. And if it seems silly to try to calculate how big the U.S. economy will be in 75 years, it should be even sillier to talk about cutting benefits now and for future retirees based on projections which are every bit as tenuous. Finally, what would I do about Social Security? The first thing I would do is I would remove the cap on wages subject to Social Security taxes. That cap is now $118,500 a year. Money you earn beyond that is not subject to Social Security taxes. I would remove that cap. And don't give me any bull about doing so is going after the middle class. An income of $120,000 a year puts you in the richest 7 or 8% of American people. That is not middle class. And we're taking a break. And we're back. And I told you that it's going to be just 2 topics this week. The first one was Social Security and the lies told about it. The second one, here, I told you last week that I would tell you about what we know about 2 still mostly secret trade deals. Trade deals which, if you hadn't heard about, don't feel bad, you weren't supposed to. The terrible trio of trade deals now being negotiated in secret includes the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, and the Trade and Services Agreement, or TISA. Now, I've mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership several times. It's the latter 2 agreements that I said I was going to tell you about this week. All right, we'll take the TTIP first, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. This is a proposed deal that's been negotiated in secret between the U.S. and the Trade Office of the European Union since June 2013. In essence, it seeks to do to the Atlantic side of the world what the Trans-Pacific Partnership seeks to do to the Pacific side, or to be more exact, I should say, to the North Atlantic part of the world, since apparently Africa is not considered important enough to be part of these negotiations. What we know about the TTIP has come through leaks and the occasional self-serving release by one of the parties involved, and what we know about it is more than enough to make any sane person who was not a corporate executive flack, lobbyist, or toady to be really deeply concerned. One group, in fact, called this agreement a corporate lobbying paradise because in 2012, during the run-up to the start of negotiations, the European Commission's Trade Department had 597 closed-door meetings with lobbyists to discuss the plan. 528 of those meetings, 88% of them, were with business lobbyists. Only 53 or 9% were with public interest groups. The rest were with people like academics. Which means, however, what it means is that for every meeting with a trade union or a consumer group or an environmental group or whatever, there were 10 with companies and their foundations and their PR flacks. What's more, there's clear evidence that during that same time, during those meetings, the Trade Department was actively seeking the involvement of corporate lobbyists in this process while keeping, again, trade unions and consumer groups and so on at arm's length. And this influence has continued not just before the negotiations, but during the negotiations. Some formulations in draft texts that have been leaked to the public are identical to proposals made by corporate lobbyists. And then, after this, you shouldn't be surprised by the kind of stuff that is in the deal. Now, in fairness, I have to say, the deal is not finalized, and so some of this may change before the final draft is produced, but considering the history of how such secret agreements go, it's actually more likely that any changes will make it worse than make it better. Now, a big important issue here is the inclusion of what's called investor-state dispute settlement. What that means is that foreign investors and corporations would have the right to sue for damages if they think that they have suffered losses as the result of the policies or laws or regulations of the targeted country. This would include even environmental and consumer protection laws and other such things. The fact that they were beneficial to the society as a whole would not matter. So, for example, Barack Obama says he wants to reduce our carbon output in order to reduce the risk and the damage of global climate change. Doing so would of necessity mean using less fossil fuel, including coal. Under this provision, if it was in effect, a foreign corporation with investments in U.S. coal mines could claim that this program had hurt the value of those investments and so sue to recover its losses. Next, under something called regulatory cooperation, corporate groups are to be included in the drafting of any new regulations or laws which might affect their trade interests. Public interest groups and workers are not invited to this because, well, they're not doing international trade, so they don't count. Employee rights are also coming under pressure, and in fact, some jobs are really threatened. But the International Labor Organization, this is part of the United Nations. The International Labor Organization has established 8 core standards for labor rights and protections. In the United States, only 2 of them are formally recognized, and the TTIP provides no protection for the others. Meanwhile, privatization and so-called liberalization, and oh, I do hate that word, because if you liberalize something, it should mean, you know, making it better, improving it somehow. But here, what it means is giving corporations a freer hand to do whatever they doggone well please. But privatization and liberalization become one-way streets. Once some public asset or service has been handed over to private industry, turning it back into a public asset will be made almost impossible by this agreement. It's a blueprint for over time turning over more and more of government services provided for the benefit of the public into profit centers for the benefit of corporations and their investors. And this has even already happened in the case of water in Latin America. Through a process called regulatory convergence, the standards of things like food safety and consumer protection for commodities like cosmetics, medical products, pesticides, and others are threatened with being set at whatever is the lowest standard currently in force. In many cases, that actually would be the U.S. standards, because our standards on such things tend to be weaker than those in Europe. For example, in Europe, a company has to prove that a substance is safe before they can use it. In the U.S., it's the other way around, and a corporation can use whatever substance it wants until it's proved that it's not safe. So under this agreement, instead of us being able to improve or toughen our consumer protection, the nations of the European Union would have to weaken theirs. But doesn't all go one way. No, no, no. The financial rules, the controls on banks are actually tougher in the U.S. than they are in the European Union. And under the same rubric of regulatory convergence, European banks are pressing for the TTIP to require the U.S. to weaken its controls on banks and weaken its financial regulations. The already weak, the already wounded Dodd-Frank bill would really become worth less than the paper it's printed on. Now all that is obviously not the whole agreement, but it should be more than enough to show you why so many environmental, public interest, consumer, and labor groups, particularly in Europe, where this agreement has gotten a lot more attention than it has here, why so many groups have come to oppose it. Which leads us to the last leg of this three-headed beast of corporate wet dreams. It's called the Trade and Services Agreement, or TISA, and in a nutshell, it seeks to create the same kind of transnational corporation playground in services that the TTP and the TTIP look to do in goods. Negotiations have been taking place in secret, of course, since early 2013. A year ago, WikiLeaks published the secret core text being used in these negotiations, negotiations which today involve over 50 nations, making up 2/3 of the world's global product. Nations including the U.S., the European Union, and others such as Turkey, Mexico, Australia, Pakistan, and Israel, but interestingly not including the so-called BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which have been barred from taking place in these negotiations, even though this new treaty is supposed to benefit the entire global economy. Apparently some nations are not supposed to be part of that economy. But anyway, getting to the agreement. According to analysts, the core agreement actually looks to undermine the governments that are involved in creating the treaty in favor of multinational corporations. One way is that it would require signatories to the treaty to give up their right to choose local services and local service providers in areas like broadcasting, education, electricity, sanitation, and so on. The phrase "buy local" for governments would become illegal. The text also looks to limit government's ability to regulate national services while giving unprecedented access to transnational corporations. It would apply to all services: banking, finance, e-commerce, health, transport, consulting, all of them across the board, and the rules would affect all levels of government from local to national. It also proposes restricting the ability of governments to set size or growth limits on any sectors of the economy, such as banks, which means the expression "too big to fail," which at least suggests that this is not a happy situation and carries the implication that institutions smaller than that can be regulated or even broken up. Too big to fail would become as passé as poodle skirts and rotary telephones. The rules not only apply to internal matters, they also apply to capital flow. It restricts governments from putting controls on cross-border movements of capital. And that's not the end of this. In June of this year, 2 months ago, WikiLeaks released another set of documents related to the TISA. These documents show the intention is to deregulate global financial service markets and assist the expansion of financial multinationals. Now, in these new revelations, I found two of them particularly disturbing. One is that, quoting the WikiLeaks release, the leaked draft also shows that the U.S. is particularly keen on boosting cross-border data flow, which would allow uninhibited exchange of personal and financial data. And privacy and personal information can go the way of the dodo. I mean, who knew when the amazing Mr. O promised to have the most transparent administration ever, what he actually meant is that we have to be transparent to the corporations. Oh, but wait, the treaty does have a chapter on transparency. It mandates that regulators must tell transnational investors what they're doing before they do it. The other particularly disturbing revelation in this is that amendments proposed by the U.S. would end publicly provided services like public pension funds, which are described as monopolies. It would also limit public regulation of all financial services to the level they are at now, so when another 2008 happens, as we all know it will, we won't be able to do anything about it except, of course, bail the banks out again. Heard enough? Actually, no, you haven't. Not until you're reminded of one more thing. Negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership began in 2008. They have continued to the present. Those on the Trade and Services Agreement began in February 2013. Those on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership began in June 2013. So the administration of which U.S. president has been pushing for these deals? The administration of which U.S. president wants U.S. consumer protections, environmental and other such regulations cut to the lowest common denominator? The administration of which U.S. president wants to slash away our privacy rights and calls public pension plans monopolies? I don't know how many times I have to say it. These people are not on your side. That's it for this week. We will see you next week. Have the best week you possibly can. And for now, as always, peace.